Have you seen me dice bag? The Grognard Files.
Hello, my name is Dirk the Dice, and this is the Grognard Files podcast, where we talk bobbins about tabletop RPGs from back in the day and today. I'm coming live from my den here in the heart of the northwest of England, and completely surrounded by my stuff. Here we are again, talking about monsters. Is this a monster manual too far? Are we reaching for the giant shrews, the seasonal variations of orcs, or at the point of indescribables that we're going to have to describe? You can be the judge. In this third part of our examination of the world of RPG bad guys, we have an interview with Free League's Tomas Harenstam, who coordinated the production of two of the best Bestiaries from the past couple of years, Forbidden Lands Book of Beasts, Dragonbane's Bestiary. In Open Box, the part of the show where we look backwards to look forwards, Thomas tells us about the formative years of Swedish role-playing and what's needed to make a bestiary work. Judge Blythe, the resident rules lawyer, and my self-appointed sidekick in the Zoom of role-playing rambling, answering listener questions in a special monster edition of Thunder Phase, where we answer with medium fire responses. I should say that it sounds like listening into a wiretap as we were recording it over a phone. Nevertheless, we also managed to squeeze in some closing time chatter. I'll be back at the end with some notices. Until then, ramblers, let's get rambling. Open Box! Welcome to the Zoom of Role-Playing Rambling. I'm joined today by Tomas Harenstam. Harenstam. How do I pronounce it, Thomas?
Harenstam is good, but yeah, it's a tricky one.
Wait, so where in the world are you beaming from?
I'm right now in our little office in Stockholm, Sweden, where we're based.
Excellent. And I saw you recently on the stream for the Ennies with your team.
That was amazing. That was great. It was such a fun night to celebrate everybody and all the great games. And of course, it was not bad to get that fan favorite award. That was, and bring everybody up on stage. That was a lot of fun.
And I've come back into role playing after a period of deep freeze. And what I found really interesting is the story of Sweden and gaming and role playing. Mm-hmm. It's something I wasn't aware of. So, what was your background? How did you get into role playing?
I mean, I started playing like a lot of other kids my age in the mid '80s. There was a big boom for role playing games here in Sweden back then. Of course, then the games were only in Swedish and were released by a Swedish publisher. I mean, there were some people playing D&D and some foreign games, but it was very small, and it only took off after a local publisher, published two games in the early '80s. First, Drakar och Demoner, which is a fantasy title. That's actually not a translation of D&D, even though you might think so from the name, but it was a translation, the very first edition of a game called Fantasy World by Chaosium. So it's a basic role-playing at its core. Then Drakar och Demoner took off in many strange directions after that, but it started out as that. And then the other game they did was called Mutant, which was a post-apocalyptic game. So those were published in '82 and '84 and became huge here in this small country. So that was Mutant was my first game. I got it for my 11th birthday, I think, and me and my brother just started playing, and that's how we kind of get started. And a lot of kids, well, mostly boys back then, unfortunately, but still, played RPGs here, and those two were the big ones. And I started writing stuff for role-playing games almost right away. I mean, I think in RPGs in general, playing and creating are so intertwined. It's such a creative hobby. So, and it was for me. So I also started writing, tinkering, and doing things almost right away, and kept doing that, but only on for fun, for for my own games. Up until I also had a bit of a deep freeze around the turn of the millennium. Around those years, I was doing other things, like a serious job and things like that. So, but then I got back into it like in the mid O's, around 06, 07, started playing again, started writing again, and that kind of we were a small group of freelancers starting writing for another Swedish publisher that was around at the time. And that kind of became Free League. And a couple of years later, that became the company Free League. And we started publishing games first only in Swedish and then in English as well. So, and then kind of just grew from there.
And a Mutant obviously becomes Mutant Year Zero.
Yeah.
I've not seen the two. So how does that differ? Is it does the latest game have much of the same elements of the old game?
I would think so. Right. I mean, Mutant Year Zero was actually our version of Mutant, which was that original old game from '84. And Mutant Year Zero, as the kind of the title suggests, it's actually a prequel. So it's a bit more less civilized, because the original Mutant and another version that was quite popular by another publisher and that was released in '02 or something and lived for a number of years, was actually in a more kind of almost steampunky style. It was a more civilized. It was a post-apocalyptic game, but it had like nations and cities and things. And we wanted to go back to, there was always a backstory for Mutant where there was a more uncivilized era, right closer to the actual apocalypse. So that's what we set out to explore. And that's actually Mutant Year Zero. And that's hence also the name Year Zero.
And the mechanics which have become so integral to Free League products, and where did they come from? Do they have their origins in that game?
Right. No, I mean, the mechanics were completely new to Mutant. Both Mutant and Draklemoner, that fantasy game, both had the same core mechanics, and they were derived from basic role playing, that Chaosium, RuneQuest, Call of Cthulhu style of mechanics. That was that. So for Mutant Year Zero, we did something completely different, and that was quite controversial here at the time, because a lot of people wanted a new version of Mutant to have similar rules to the previous versions. But we did something very different. Back then, I was heavily inspired by the Forge movement, the indie games that were around in the O's, and so it has a lot of inspiration from there. It also grew out of some stuff that I did like in the late 90s when I was just tinkering on a game that also used like a dice pool D6 type of mechanic. And then when I got wind of the indie movement and the Forge movement and all of those games, I really got very inspired by those. So there's a lot of stuff and ideas from games like Apocalypse World, Fate, Mouse Guard, things like that were inspirational to Mutant Year Zero. Even though even then it wasn't a full-on indie game, it still had some traditional elements to it in terms of gameplay. So we always thought, even back then, that was something like a neo-trad, like a traditional RPG, but with inspiration from indie games, if that makes sense. And that's kind of how that came to be. And back then, the Year Zero engine was not an engine. We never called it that. It was just the rules we developed for Mutant Year Zero. So it was only later that we actually started using the same core of the rules for other games.
And it has proven to be remarkably versatile as a engine, because you applied it to so many different settings and situations.
Yeah, we tried it first for Coriolis, and then we ended up using it for Tales from the Loop, and then it made sense to use it for Forbidden Lands, and then for Alien, and then yeah. So not all of our games use it, but I think most of them do, and it's not the same rules in every game. It's very much tweaked and adapted to what type of game it is and what type of stories we want to tell in the game. So, and I think it's the core of the engine is so simple, really. It's so easy to grasp that it also makes it very easy to adapt and tweak and change and adapt it to different types of games. So even though it shares some very core mechanic across the titles, it's quite different also. So you'll get a unique experience from each game.
Yeah, that's been my experience because I've used it in Varson and in Twilight 2000. So the application of it is quite different, isn't it, on that scale?
It is. Yeah, definitely.
And when I think of Free League, I think of the engine, but I also think of the fabulous art that you. How important is that to you as a product designer and a creator?
It is important for sure. I think that's also been part of what we've been doing from the very start. That yes, the game design and the writing must be there, but also the art and the graphic design. And it's always been very important for us to have all of those things. I think one part of the reason for that is one of the founders of Free League is a graphic designer and was a graphic designer by trade. So I think that made it easy for us to get good graphic design from the very beginning because we had a professional in the team on that front already. And also art, very important. We had some good connections with great artists even back then, and it's always been part of what we do to make sure we have the right art for the game. So yeah, it was important and still is for everything that we do.
Over recent podcasts, we've been looking specifically at the antagonists at monsters. As a designer of a couple of great bestiaries, what do you think makes a really good bestiary?
It's a good question. I mean, we released two fairly recently. There is the Book of Beasts for Forbidden Lands, and then there is the Bestiary for Dragonbane, which is even more recent. So those are and then we actually have a monster codex for Symbaroum as well. That was released a number of years back. So I guess we have a few under our belt. And the two latest ones are the ones that I've been mostly involved with. And I think for both of them, it has to be inspiring to read and look through. And that needs to be there. And that goes both, of course, again, art, very important for a bestiary, I think, and inspirational texts, but also that it is immediately useful. At least that's what we think. So not just a book of pretty pictures of monsters and some text about and some stats, but also in both of these bestiaries that we have done, there are adventure seeds, there are random encounters for each monster. So you can actually, we even think, I think it was in the Book of Beasts that we called it a bestiary you can play. So basically that's not just the bestiary, but you can just plug it into your campaign and play it, because also Forbidden Lands is very much a sandbox style game where you can just roam the land and encounter things, and the story kind of evolves from that. So basically you could just take the Book of Beasts and plug that into your campaign and use the random encounters in there to drive your game. So in that sense, it's not just a book of monsters, but it's an adventure book. You can play it.
James Holloway, who we've had on the podcast, said that the antagonists are core to role-playing games because obviously PCs are determined by the players. So do you subscribe to that? And when you're designing this, what are the because you mentioned that you see them as a utility as well as looking very, very attractive. So what's the thought process when you're designing some of these monsters that appear in here?
Right. I mean, that is a key thing. Like you say, monsters are, especially for fantasy titles, of course, they can be human or humanoid opponents that are interesting as well. But the monsters have a really, I think, key place in fantasy games, and it is something that we've been trying to work with, is to make meeting a monster interesting in several ways. And because so you don't end up with the monster just being a big pile of hit points that you have to wear down, because that gets fairly boring. We have tried to do this in a few different ways. In one way is that interaction with the monster doesn't only need to be violent. There are ways to interact with the monster that they might have some specific weakness. They might be possible to actually reason with. And interact with them in ways that are not immediately obvious, maybe, but there are different avenues to approach a monster rather than just hit it with a sword, even though that can be part of it too. So that's one thing. And another thing that we've tried to do is something that we actually use in both of these latest bestiaries, is what we call monster attacks. And that the monster attacks is just it's actually a random table where you roll dice to see what the monster does. And some of those things that the monster does are completely rule breaking and horrific, and some of them are just silly or strange. And that makes monsters less predictable and more dangerous and harder to. It's a different experience than fighting a human opponent, because you know what they can do. They can basically do the same kinds of things that your character can do. But the monster can do something completely different, and you won't know what that is. Not even the game master will know what the monster is going to do. And that makes the monster frightening and interesting to meet, because it's much more of a unknown, which I think monsters should be. They shouldn't feel too easily predictable. So those are two ways, I think, that we've tried to make meeting and encountering monsters interesting in these books.
Yeah, the monster attack table is great, and I first saw that applied in the Alien game, and that added an additional dimension to it. And I think I've got the Forbidden Lands book in front of me, and some of the results are really imaginative.
Yeah, some of them are really fun. Yeah.
So talk us through the process of how you come to create a book like this, which is fabulous, by the way. Great work.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a bit different. I mean, it depends on the game, really. I mean, for the Book of Beast for Forbidden Lands, that game actually has a fairly sizable bestiary in the core game already, which actually uses because the whole game Forbidden Lands is based on art from the early editions of the Swedish game I mentioned, Drakar och Demoner. So it's actually actual 80s art, which by specifically one artist, Nils Gulliksson, who did some really iconic art back then. So basically, Forbidden Lands is a game that grew out of his old art. And he did a lot of monsters. He did bestiaries back in the 80s that were big, big things, big sellers back then. So we actually have quite a lot of monsters based on that old art in the core game. So when we did the Book of Beasts, we had to go elsewhere. So that meant the kind of the obvious ones, the classic fantasy monsters, they were already done. So there we did. We went in some different directions and tried to think of what other kinds of strange monsters could we do that are not your most obvious choices, and that led to some interesting ones and some strange ones. That I think you have the Twisted Ent, you have water trolls, you have Tupilax, you have all kinds, like not perhaps the most obvious choices of monsters. And then we found the right artist to draw these, and Forbidden Lands uses based on that old art, it's black and white, hand-drawn style. And of course, for the new art, we needed a new artist, and we couldn't, because the old art was already used. So then we had to find someone who does art in not the exact same style, but something that works with that old style. So I think that art in this book also is a big part of it, and it kind of reinforces that kind of old school feel and these a bit odd and strange monsters that you might not expect. So that's kind of the process there. I think for Dragonbane, the bestiary there, Dragonbane is more, it's not old school in the same sense, even though it is actually a new edition of Drakar och Demoner again that I mentioned, but it's more of more of a game based on. It doesn't have quite the same old school feel. It's more contemporary, I guess, in terms of its design. So, and it's also one title of ours that is designed to be beginner friendly more than the others. I think if it's like the best game to get started with of ours if you're completely new to role playing. So that also meant that the bestiary needed to be a bit more accessible. So that there we have more of the classic monsters that you would kind of expect to find in a fantasy bestiary. I think the artist David Brazzagalla did amazing work in this one as well, just to kind of inspire and really. And it's important that each bestiary, I think, has. I mean, we prefer to work with one single artist for a whole book, basically. It doesn't have to be, but at least it's important that the style is very coherent, and you feel like, because if each image looks in a different style, that kind of takes you out of the world, at least for me. So the style needs to kind of stay consistent to make you feel like you're still part of the same world, and I think he really did that. So in both cases, the art was really important.
Is the art the starting point? What happens then? Do you have a team of writers, or how does that
often
work?
the art, I mean, often the art can be the starting point. Some ideas for what would be cool what would be cool monsters to encounter, but that can start with the art as well. And then we had a few writers involved. Personally, I'm mostly involved on the kind of game mechanic side of things. So I was involved in writing up the monster attacks and other mechanical effects of the monsters. That was mainly my end of things. Whereas other writers, Andreas Marklund and others, did a lot of the Magnus Seder and others did a lot of great work on the more on the fluff side of things, the description, the inspirational text and things like that. So
yeah, and I like how that sets out some stories set from people within the world, so their attitudes towards the creatures, and also some random lore that might be circulating that might be beneficial to the players when they encounter it. I think that's a really good device. I think
it is nice. We have some little quotes in the Dragonbane Bestiary, from like in-world quotes from people who say something or think something about these monsters. It might be true, it might be nonsense, but it's just someone's opinion of this particular creature. And that's always fun and can be inspirational to read as well, and how to present them in your game or just read them for fun.
So Free League, onward and upwards. What are the current projects that you're working on that you can tell us about?
We have a bunch of things. We're working on a new edition of the Coriolis. It's a sci-fi RPG, an original one of ours, and also a new edition of the Alien RPG, actually. So both of them, and especially Alien, has monsters in it, obviously. So that's a big part, even though they're not fantasy bestiaries, really. That still, it's the monster component of the game is very important, obviously, in Alien. So that's something we're refining that thing even more. So that's one of the big ones that I'm working on at the moment. And also, Vaesen that you mentioned, that is based on Nordic folklore. That's actually a whole game based on a bestiary. The bestiary that was written and illustrated by Johan Egerkrantz, and that art book that he did is basically a bestiary of creatures of Nordic folklore, and we turned that into a game. So that is very much also a monster-based game, even though it's set in what we call a mythic North. It's not exactly the actual 19th century Northern Europe, but a mythic version of it, where the myths and the creatures are real and need to be handled in some way. So again, monsters are very key to that game as well. And then we're doing more for that game too. That's coming up.
Well, thank you very much, Thomas, for spending some time with the Grognard Files. It's been great having you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thunderface Monsters!
Welcome to the Zoom of Role-Playing Rambling. I've got Blythe with me. Hello, Blythe.
Hello, Dirk.
I think if you grab that barrel over there, Blythe, is there anything in it? Is there something else in it?
Well, that dead horse we need to flog over there.
Flogging a dead boule, as they say around here. Now, people might notice by the sound that it's a bit unusual. I'm actually in the storeroom at work, and I'm next to the Robinson's summer fruits. You'll be glad to know that there's still some left. If you ever want to come and visit Blythe.
Someone's still drinking it, even though it's 3 years out of date.
It's more than 3 years. I think about 5 years it's been here.
5 years out of date, someone's drinking it.
Yeah, that somebody is drinking it.
Sure, can you trust these dates on anything? I mean,
you're in Little Wigan. We're actually on a phone, aren't we? So it sounds a bit like we're coming into land.
Yeah, like air traffic control.
I invited people to submit questions to us about monsters, and the Grog Squad have obliged, and we've got some questions to answer. So it's one of those thunder phases. So are you ready? First off, Thunderface. First question. Yeah.
Go on.
First question comes from Jen Gilbert. What is a monster? What is a monster?
Good question, that, isn't it? Because people play, for example, fantasy games. They'll play an elf or a dwarf, won't they? And then they'll go and fight a kobold, and the kobold is a monster, but the elf isn't a monster. Why? Just because it's a player character? But then, I don't know, that seems weird, because there are games where you can sort of stretch it a bit and play and a monstrous character, like drow maybe. Sometimes are considered monsters in some games, but you can play one. Ducks are a good example in Galantha, aren't they? Because they're not human. You might say a troll in Galantha is a monster, but you can play a troll, and a duck is a monster. Seems weird, but yeah. I don't know the answer to that, Jem.
We need to be careful here, Blythe. I think this is a cultural studies professor leading us into an identity politics trap. And we'll say something.
Trap, isn't it? It's a trap, yeah. He's the monster for laying a trap.
Because I think this goes back to relativism in games that we encounter now compared with back in the day. Now, we've got some of it in RuneQuest, haven't we? So what determines a monster? Does the appearance of a species or a creature within a monster manual designate it by its very nature? Does it become defined because it's appeared in a bestiary? Does it become a monster?
Yeah, I mean, Galantha is a great example of it, actually, because you have got like trolls and Moracans and lots of creatures. And then you've got, at one extreme, though, you've got things like Jacko-bears and Brew, haven't you, that are like creatures of chaos that are defined more as a monster, aren't they? So in RuneQuest, a dark troll, not really viewed as a monster, just viewed as a non-human creature. Yet a Brew or a Jacko-bear, for example, would be viewed as a monster, wouldn't it? But what really divides them? Maybe what divides them is monstrous behaviour. Maybe a monster is defined by its behaviour. Maybe
by its intent.
Yeah, maybe that's the thing, isn't it? And that certainly, I would say, is there in kind of the original versions of things like D&D, where you get monsters like they're evil, they're classed as evil, and elves and dwarves are classed as good. So kobold is a monster because it's some lawful evil creature that has, it doesn't have mankind's best interests at heart. It's an enemy, whereas elves are not. You can sort of pinpoint some monsters. Going back to the Galantha thing, the trolls in Galantha are civilized. They have their own culture. They deal with humans. There's friendly relations to some extent. Whereas a Jacko-bear is just some creature of the night, isn't it? That you don't negotiate with. It's just they're out there to get you, basically. So that kind of behaviour and, as you say, intent thing is certainly part of it, but doesn't quite answer.
What you're doing in your description there is comparing them against humans. So I think we still veer towards anything that isn't human has the potential to be a monster. So even a duck, we always pick ducks because the ridiculousness of them. You couldn't say that a duck is a monster, but if its intent is such, or it manifests, say, as an undead duck with malign intent, it suddenly becomes a monster.
Threat to mankind. That's the kind of
See, again, you're using that mankind thing.
Well, I think, but don't you think that the origins of monsters are? I mean, let's be honest. Monsters are all made up. The only real thing in all of this, human beings. So monsters at the very origins. Forget about role-playing games for a minute, because maybe that's a slightly different argument, isn't it? A monster in a role-playing game is a different thing because that's an imagined reality where there are these other creatures alongside humans. Whereas monsters in their origins are these inhuman creatures. So referencing it to humans to some extent has some validity. But I suppose that validity disappears when you put it into a role-playing game. where there are friendly elves or friendly ducks. There's a friendly duck village just around the corner. Oh, well, they're not monsters, they're friendly duck people. That's not a problem. But of course, in the real world, if you saw a duck person, you'd think, Christ, that's a monster, wouldn't you? Because they don't exist. In a fantasy world, a fantasy setting, that feels very wrong. That's just kind of prejudicial, isn't it? But the origins of monsters in the real world, in the world of myth literature, I suppose they're not human. They're not natural as well. They're not natural, are they? A monster, like a tiger in the jungle, is not a monster because it's a tiger. But something resembling a tiger that's kind of unusual or mythical or whatever is classed as a monster, isn't it? So it's where they sit outside the real world, isn't it? Are the other questions easier than this one?
Do you do mild?
It has that relativism, doesn't it? And taken to its ultimate degree, there's a cartoon that was shared on the Discord, which showed a party of adventurers slaying a mind flayer. And one of the adventurers announces, "Oh, great, it's got a potion of healing." And then there's another panel cut into a baby mind flayer in its bed and its mother over it saying, "Don't worry, Dad's on his way with the medicine."
Well, mind flayers are a good example, aren't they, actually? Because they have all those kind of inhuman, evil qualities, don't they? They're just not very nice. But they also have, I don't know, magical element, like a supernatural quality where you think, do mind flayers have babies? Do they have families like that? I get a take joke. Do they operate? Like, I don't know, it's a strange one, isn't it? Because once you go down that road of saying, oh, mind flayers have feelings too, the game becomes quite difficult, doesn't it? I mean, maybe it should become difficult, I don't know. But there's something to be said for having a big bad monster, isn't
There is.
The very essence of these games is about those kind of things, isn't it?
And we've recently, as we've said a number of times, playing in the homebrew world of Racklash, and as part of that, people are discovering that as players. I do often get the sense that because it's an unfamiliar world, people are not quite sure of what the relationship of the different species that exist in the world. So people are reluctant to engage in combat with monstrous creatures because they're not quite sure of the nature of the monstrosity. I'm thinking of Mark and his reluctance to face down the Pakator, this great elephant centaur creature, because I wasn't quite sure, even though it was like a Ray Harryhausen type monster and it kind of brought down the trees. He wasn't sure are they just trying to live their lives?
In that game, at that point, I asked that question, didn't I? I think I said to you, what is our attitude to these things? Our character's attitude? What do we think of them? What does the world think of them? Would we think of them as terrible monsters that need to be slain, or would we just see them as you say, an alternative creature living its life? Because he's right, we didn't quite know, because it's a new monster in a new world, isn't it? You know, whereas, as you say, in D&D, a mind flayer pops up, we all go, Jesus, kill the mind flayer. It's a mind flayer. We know where we stand. What do we think of this thing? Can we talk to it and go, steady on, calm down, we don't mean you any harm? It's a difficult question. And I do think it's possibly a different answer in the world of literature and myths compared to different game settings. And in different game settings, it could be a different answer, couldn't it? I think like in Gulantha, the idea of chaos, the idea of creatures of chaos defines things as monsters more than them just being different, doesn't it? So trolls are not creatures of chaos. They hate chaos as much as anyone. Whereas brews are creatures of chaos, and therefore they're monsters. Trolls are not. That's the way RuneQuest gets around it, I think, to my mind anyway. But it differs, I think, in different games, doesn't it?
Yeah. Context and intent. These are supposed to be quick fire questions, so I think we did all right with that.
It's a good question, but blimey.
Yeah. And I think we avoided the traps. Thunderface! Wayne Peters. What monster bores you senseless and you avoid using? What monster bores you senseless and you avoid using?
No, that was orcs. That's really like indigestion then. Orcs.
Quick fire questions, but you might need to give me a bit more than that. Why do you think orcs are a boring monster?
I mean, I know you could make them interesting, because you make any monster interesting, can't you? That's not a problem. But I think often the way they're presented, it's just like they're just big green people with bad teeth and spears, aren't they? They just seem very dull, and they're often just slotted in as like terrible creatures. So it's just like, oh, there's a temple down the road that worships some death god. Oh, it's a little bunch of orcs doing it. Oh, right, of course. Oh, they're the henchmen to the priest. They're just, oh, here we go, orcs. Oh, boring. They don't really do much, do they? They're just people, just like people, really, aren't they? That, you know, with a with a very bad reputation, which legitimize killing them all. But they're quite dull. It's like, compare them to, say, kobolds, which we talked about before. You know, kobolds, slightly more interesting, like the traps they set, the fact they're quite puny, so they might use tactics other than a full frontal assault, makes them slightly more interesting than an orc. But the orcs I find them a bit dull, or maybe just they're overused. I don't know, but I never consider using. If I'm together an adventure, I will never consider using an orc. And if an adventure has orcs in it, I'll always consider using something else instead, because they're just more interesting.
There's many variants of them as well, isn't there? The hobgoblin. Where does the hobgoblin start and the orc end, and vice versa?
But I do find that kind of stuff a bit dull.
I think in these discussions, though, we've tended to prefer the individual monstrosity compared with the hordes. Do you think that's something to do with the fact that they come in hordes, that if you encounter a dungeon or a settlement that you have to deal with, as player characters, you'll have to deal with lots of orcs, and that is what bores you.
Yeah, the sword fodder thing, isn't it? That these are never the big bad. They're not just the hordes surrounding it. I suppose, to be fair to 5th edition D&D, that did try to kind of make them a little more fearsome, didn't it? And a little more terrifying. I think it kind of boosted some of the stats and made them a bit more interesting, I suppose. But then 5th edition did that to a lot of monsters. So again, it's kind of like, well, you made them on. If you boosted a lot of the stats and abilities of a lot of monsters, then, well, the orcs still seem a little bit dull.
I find any monsters that are slow bore me. It might be a personal prejudice I've got, but I don't see the point of a slow monster.
Giant slug, can you just outrun it?
We encountered, didn't we, a flail snail in a recent adventure.
Yeah, they nearly killed the dwarf. The dwarf was on 1 hit point back then. Got battered. But to take your point, as you said in the game, you can run past it and it's not going to catch you, is it?
And when it comes to hordes of creatures and having repetitive encounters, the ultimate manifestation of bringing together hordes and slowness is zombies. I just think zombies bore me stupid. I mean, come on, let's all move on from zombies.
Yeah, I agree. I think zombies are only interesting when it's the players that raise the dead and make zombies. I think zombies can be interesting if it's the player who uses the create undead spell. That's kind of quite fun. But I take your point. Yeah, they are a bit dull. Zombies, something skeletons can be a bit like that, can't they? It's a similar kind of thing. Even though I suppose on the plus side, skeletons, you think of Jason and the Argonauts, don't you? But they can be a bit dull. But yeah, zombies, yeah, because like you say, they slow out. The idea that they're quite slow. At least the skeletons are perceived as be quick, can't the skeletons running around something else? But yeah, the shuffling zombie, just shut the door and it won't catch me. It'll be fine.
It becomes a different proposition when it becomes like a 28 Days Later one, or a Train to Busan, or the Kingdom version, where they've got a bit of energy to them. But yeah, the traditional shuffling zombie, it's just ridiculous.
Zombie films sometimes like that, doesn't it? The shuffling. You think, how did this zombie plague ever really get started? Because if there's like a patient zero zombie, it wouldn't be that hard to contain, would it? I mean, they're shuffling along. If they like you say, if they're like in Kingdom, if they're kind of like running super strength, super powered zombies, oh no, we're in trouble. That's right, you really are in trouble, aren't you? Because these things are fast. But You do. You look at them and you think, if it's a zombie plague with one zombie that started biting people, how did it ever catch anybody? Run away.
Thunderface. Brian Dugay. Monsters are people too, but which monsters do you think would make the best people, e.g. used as PCs? Which are the best monsters to play?
You think?
Now, well, I'm going to bring in the high horse. Come on, because most of our high horse games come from back in that period when we briefly came back from my deep freeze and we played with Kevin. Kevin was the ultimate power gamer, as we've explained before. Grognard Files pass him. And you, as a games master, allowed him to play a Minotaur. The rest of us were just humans, a standard party. But you had seen in Unearthed Arcana, I think, or one of the supplements, that it was possible for him to play a Minotaur. Now, did he play him like a monster? No. Did he play him like a powered-up paladin? Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. And that is a problem with playing a monster, isn't it? The idea that it just gives you extra powers without any of the role-playing problems of being a monster.
So when you played trolls in RuneQuest Glorantha, did you feel like you were a troll, or did you feel just like you were a superhuman with different strengths and abilities?
Yeah, I think you do. I think the dark troll is the classic example of that, isn't it? Where you are just they are better than humans, aren't they? I mean, they don't really have much in the way of a downside. The thing about darkness, I suppose, the light problem of not being able to see in the daylight. But again, if you're a party of dark troll, it's less of a problem, isn't it? You just all go around in the dark, so it's all right. But yeah, they have that thing, don't they? They just powered up people, really.
How do you deal with that? So last year we played Vampire the Masquerade, and that has particular mechanics to help you feel monstrous, doesn't it? It has that hunger mechanic.
I suppose Vampire the Masquerade is a good example, is that from a game mechanics point of view, from a kind of game balance point of view, it's okay because you're all vampires. That works quite well in Vampire the Masquerade, doesn't it? The idea that everyone's a vampire. It's not like one person's a vampire and has superpowers and the other people are no humans. Everyone's a vampire and everyone has their own particular powers, things like that. And I suppose what surprised me, I think we said this at the time, what surprised me about Vampire the Masquerade is it is all about the vampires. The humans not that significant in it. So, you might be a powered up vampire, but when we went to that party, didn't we? And there's like a ball or a meeting, and you meet these really powerful vampires, and you think, oh, blimey, we're not very powerful at all, are we? These guys are really powerful. Ooh. So that's okay. I think the problem is you drop a monster into a game like that, Minotaur. Oh yes, RuneQuest. Oh, you can be a dark troll, and we'll hand wave the night side thing, the darkness thing, and the other players are humans. There is an imbalance, isn't there? Because there doesn't seem to be a downside. Doesn't seem to be a downside.
If you are a monster and you've got monstrous urges, then you should have to deal with them within game. So it'd be like a hindrance, wouldn't it, in Savage Worlds terms? If you're a troll, that you've got an insatiable hunger and you need to eat live creatures to satisfy that hunger, that needs to be role play, but it also needs to have a mechanical penalty if you don't satisfy it.
Yes, because you can't just rely on people's good faith to role play. You've got to have some kind of mechanic, which of course Vampire the Masquerade does do, doesn't it? That does.
Yes,
it doesn't. Yeah. The thing about hunger. So.
Yeah, and I think that's what I was driving at, that idea that, there needs to be some mechanical way of dealing with that, that your appetites are different or your outlook is different.
Yeah, or I suppose another way of dealing with it in a simpler way is, not fitting into society. So if you are playing a Minotaur, you're not going to be able to walk around the city. You're not going to be able to fit in to society, and that's going to create all sorts of social problems for you, which the other characters don't have.
I don't think Kevin had such problems, but anyway, we'll move on.
I don't think he had those problems. I think it's like the adventure playing, isn't it? Didn't have those problems because the adventure is very kind of dungeon based, so it doesn't matter, does it? That's the problem there. I think if someone's playing a monster, you have to maybe incorporate that, as a games master, present them with more social problem. We've drifted off the point here because we haven't decided on which monster would make a good player character, have we?
Well, I think trolls in RuneQuest are a good monster to play because, as you say, they do have one. You've got a whole supplement there that describes how the ecology works, how your culture, how your attitudes to life. It is possible to make really good play characters, but there are others, aren't there? I just think, I think inevitably they become surrogate humans unless you go for a shotgun.
But also, I think depends where the game is taking place as well. So going back to that thing about the Minotaur, if you stick a player character as a Minotaur in a dungeon, and it's just a big mega dungeon, and you're wandering around fighting monsters, that Minotaur is like a tank. Whereas you've put them in a village, it becomes more problematic. But I suppose as well, playing monsters, I'm thinking now of the TNT variant, Monsters. It's a very different proposition, isn't it? If someone says, I'd like to play a Manticore, and you'd think, oh, for crying out loud, playing a Manticore, it's ridiculous. But it's not ridiculous if the players are defenders of the dungeon. That trick of turning it on its head. Then it becomes a very different proposition, doesn't it? And you can have a lot of fun playing a monster. You could play a Manticore, couldn't you? You're the creatures in the dungeon, defending the dungeon against adventurers. So it works. That kind of works a lot better. Whereas if that context is different and someone says, I'd like to play Manticore, I think, oh, come on, we're never going to work, is it? But if you put them in a certain context, it does work. I mean, you ran a game once, didn't you, where we were goblins in a dungeon and our job was to fix and maintain the traps in the dungeon, which were all very dangerous. And that sort of works, doesn't it?
Thunder Phase. Okay, this is a bit of a converse of the earlier one. So the question about a silly monster. Which monster appears to be great at first sight, but just doesn't work?
That's a good question.
Not a particular monster, but a particular effect. And I think I may have touched on this in the previous episode. And dramatically, when you see monsters portrayed on film, very often they have special features that work dramatically, but they don't work within a game because anything that takes agency away from the players ends up being ultimately not very satisfying. A monster will have the ability to charm and disarm a player character, which that is dramatically interesting, isn't it? Where you've lost control, you're being drawn towards its power, and you have the potential of being eaten. But in a game, that just, to me, never quite works. It's never quite satisfying. It looks great on paper, but when it happens, everybody, the Jacobur can do it, can't it? And lots of vampires can do it. But when they do it, it never feels quite satisfying. It feels like, oh, right, okay, well, can't do anything then, can I? And when you get to that point, I always think it gets a bit disappointing unless you give people a way out.
To elaborate on that as well, I think even possibly more problematic, the kind of monsters that charm people, but then don't eat them. So I was reading an adventure recently that had quite a lot of that in it. It had like dryads and satyrs and people who think creatures that charmed the players. Then it was like charm person, and so you could roll every few weeks to see if you could break out of it. And like you say, it sort of seems the idea is good. Oh, you go into the forest and there's beautiful dryads, and they're going to try and charm you to be their husbands or wives or whatever, and keep you in the forest for eternity. That in literature, that's quite a compelling idea, isn't it? The warrior goes into the woods one day and then he's charmed years before he returns. But it is, you're right, it's boring, isn't it? They've charmed you. Oh, they've charmed the whole party. All right, well, what you can do? Oh, well, you just spend the next few months being there. Lead to players kind of harumphing and folding their arms and thinking, oh, well, what can I do? Not charmed. Similar thing is, and I don't mean like petrification, I don't mean like Medusa, but creatures that can like paralyze players as well, because they always have that problem. Some giant spider that can paralyze you, or even the real bad guy who can paralyze you, and he paralyzes the whole party because they all failed saving throws. They all do very badly off the roll. And then James Master thinks, oh, what do I do now? Does he just kill them? Does he just kill them because they're all paralysed? Oh no, I'll have to. Oh no, that doesn't work. I'll have to be taken prisoner, won't be, or something like that.
I think they cocooned a la aliens, hanging from the ceiling, and you have to roll other characters to go in and rescue the original party.
Yeah.
I think that's
I mean, maybe paralysing the whole party is actually not too bad because you like you say, can develop something from that. But it's when you paralyse 3 of them and not one of them runs away, and you go, all right.
Thunderface. Okay, this is from Scott R. So, as a player, what's the monster you've always wanted to face but never have? And, it's a double header here. We could be here all week. What's your favourite monster you've faced off against in a scenario?
I don't think I've ever faced a dragon.
Really?
I've made people face dragons numerous times. You've been one of them. You've faced dragons a few times in my game, but I don't think I've ever faced dragons player.
Yeah, we did.
No, I did. No, I tell a lie. I have once. Very high level game of 5th edition, which got slightly ludicrous. But there you go.
I assuming you're not counting the one back in the day where Simon characterised the dragon as Cliff Richard, which we've talked about before.
Cliff Richard dragon. Yeah, but I don't think we faced him off. I don't think we kind of really confronted him. We didn't fight the dragon, did we? I think we just listened to his rendition of Christmas and Wine, Mistletoe and Wine and Devil Woman. But,
Hi, yeah, absolutely. It was a vegetarian dragon, wasn't it? It's a vegetarian dragon.
Vegetarian dragon. I've been, yeah. I don't know. I was trying to think. What monsters have I never played? I mean, sorry.
That's all right. Keep your dog in. No, is your dog a monster? Or is it a creature?
It's creature. A small, annoying creature. Well, not that small.
But it has monstrous qualities, yours, don't you? Don't you call it?
Monstrous qualities now. Barking, yeah. Yeah, won't shut up.
What is it? What is that you call it? Dog to Jackal. That's it.
Dog to Jackal. He's called Dog to Jackal because he's a rescue dog, and he's a lovely dog in the house. He's a really friendly dog when he's back in that. But he's a really friendly dog. But when you take him out, he has a thing about transit vans. So if he sees a transit van, he goes bananas. He goes bananas. It's like in the house, he's the calmest, most friendly dog.
Are you sure it's my round?
I'm trying to think if there's a monster I've never faced off. I don't know. Can you think of one? Is there any you've never fought?
I've always wanted to face a Cyclops in the guise of the Harryhausen Cyclops. Giant creature where it's the thing is with giant creatures on their own, like the Cyclops, is they are very defeatable, aren't they? When you face them as a party, because although they've got some special attacks, usually they have only got one means of attack, haven't they? That's the thing about the hordes, isn't it? There's something very thrilling about bringing something down that's so big.
Yeah,
and like an unreconstituted bad guy, horrible Cyclops that you've got to kill. It's not got any family or anything. All it is it's you against it. I think I never faced that. On the beach, like in the 7th voyage. I'd love that. I'd love to do that.
Yeah. See that. Yeah.
But it's always it's the classic big ones because they always big them up in the monster manuals, don't they? Like the dragons, like the Cyclops, because they are so big and terrifying that you come to like a monster rating. You very rarely encounter them because games masters are a bit scared of putting them in front of players who are not at the appropriate level. So you sometimes don't get a chance to encounter them. They're tough to defeat, but not impossible, unless they've got companion hordes breaking you down, or it's multiple attacks. I always think that cause most problems for players, doesn't it?
There's multiple attacks, but also with those kind of big monsters as well. If they're the kind of grand finale of the adventure, the players have had to battle through, as you say, minions and other things. How, to what extent the party weakened. So it's that difference, isn't it, between the full strength adventuring party versus the big monster, the weakened adventurer party versus the big monster. It's quite a different proposition, isn't it? You know, like you say often, a fully armed party in a kind of D&D style game fighting monsters. You can throw a lot at these monsters, can't you? But if you weaken, it's a different thing altogether, isn't it? I thought it's a funny question though as well. Just made me realise something about the kind of games I run. I do tend to run more games with monsters in than I play. So the kind of even going back there, I ran a lot of basic and expert D&D, didn't I? There's a lot of monsters in it. There's a lot of monsters, and I've run a lot of 5th edition. I ran Storm King's Thunder, I ran Dragon Heist. They're big campaigns. There's a lot of monsters in them, and I run DCC and I run Old School Essentials, and I am kind of drawn to running games with monsters in, rather than playing them. You know, I often play when I think of games I play. They're often a bit more monster light, aren't they?
Yeah,
I have to run them. So I think about facing monsters. My mind's more. I have more of a games master mind when it comes to monster games than the player's mind, I suppose, in a way.
And that is a good observation, because I've got a player's mind when it comes to monsters, and less of a games master's mind, because I prefer the factional type games where there are like maybe monster light, or there may be monsters that are acting as surrogates as humans, but they've all got different intentions and different allegiances and alliances. But I don't often stick in a big monster. I don't stick a Shoggoth in it that often.
No, you don't. No, I'm more likely to stick a Shoggoth in than you.
Yeah.
It just occurred to me that I've never really thought about that till this point. But being asked that question about which monsters have you never faced, I was kind of thinking, I don't know, I've faced that many, have I? Because I tend to be the games master in our groups who will run stuff with monsters in.
Thunderphase. I was going to ask if a monster has ever put you off playing a game. This is Red Dog.
What about you? Has it happened to you?
I'm pretty sure that when I first looked at Call of Cthulhu, I looked at the monsters and thought, oh, I'm not quite sure what to do with these. I think we covered that before when we looked at Cthulhu. But there are some other games. I mean, Red Markets is a game that I enjoyed playing, but I think it was looking at the variants of again, zombies. Not quite zombies, are they? But they are zombies, aren't they? So variants of zombies. That I thought, I'm not sure if I can make a compelling scenario for this, just based on what options you've got. But in the end, when we played it, it worked quite well. But I did look at some of them, and if it can be uninspiring, some games can be uninspiring when it comes to the monsters, or you can't really initially work out how they fit. Of course, Tunnels and Trolls, the original Tunnels and Trolls, is striking because it doesn't have a list of monsters, does it? It just kind of encourages you to come up with your own, or variants of your own.
Yeah, it just has the monster rating thing, doesn't it? The number of dice they have. Yeah, like a very simple system with monster rating of 20, and it gets so many dice, and that's essentially it. Yeah, it does. Yeah. For me, sometimes the thing that puts me off a game with monsters is when it's all about one monster. So I recently acquired the PDFs of the Walking Dead game, the Free League game. And that, I take the point that game is not just about the zombies, because zombies are getting a real raw deal in this podcast, aren't they? It's not, I know it's not just about the zombies, because I know the TV show's not about the zombies. It's about people and how they interact, petty jealousies and politics of some post-apocalyptic world. I get that. But equally, I can remember reading that rulebook and thinking, and this is a stupid thing to think because I knew this already, but somehow reading the rulebook and thinking, it's just about zombies then, isn't it? It's just zombies. All right. I'm slightly uninspired by that idea that it's just the monster's just a zombie. So at every turn when you're confronted with monsters, no matter how long you play the game for, it's just going to be zombies, isn't it? It's not so much, I don't think I'm turned off by a game by its monsters. And I take your point about Call of Cthulhu. There is something when you first get Call of Cthulhu where you think, hang on, it's got D100 strength and 200 hit points. You think, what are you supposed to, like you say, supposed to do with it? Because then you get the game. Once you understand the game, it's like a different thing. But I suppose I am often disappointed when a game doesn't have many monsters.
Yeah.
That is what, it's not so much I've ever looked at a game and thought, I don't like these monsters. It's more when I look at a game, it doesn't have many monsters in it. Or I suppose that, I mean, I have a lot of time for TT. It's a great game. It has a special place kind of thing. But a bit like that, where games don't give you any monsters and say, oh, just make your own up. Don't worry, just make your own up. You think, oh, come on, I can make my own monsters. Of course I can. But give me a few, give me a few. There are a few games like that where it's very, very sparse. And that, I think it's that disappoints me. Not the monsters, but a lack of monsters that can be disappointing. That put me off a game where you think, you want me to do all the work here.
Thunder Fade. Right, this is deep lore, Doctor Who, so you might have to help me here, Ian, and go back. Do you ever think that for every monster there needs to be a MacGuffin to be used against it, or the characters must discover to finally defeat it, like Adric's Star of Mathematical Excellence badge?
The golden badge that I think is crushed. It's crushed into a Cyberman's chest, isn't it, to kill him?
I think it comes back to that. Over these three parts of this episode, we've talked about how monsters have the ability to create a reason for a game or a purpose for a game. We're trying to avoid the word narrative for a game, but that's what they can do, isn't it? They can place in a monster in the world and put in some lore around it and some MacGuffins that can defeat it or assist it or help. You can bargain with it. Does make it more interesting. Well, it's not necessary for everything, is it? It just depends on the game. I think coming to a conclusion. Context and intent. Context and intent.
Yeah. Context is everything, because in a game like Vaesen, that has a kind of MacGuffin quality to it, doesn't it? In that, not necessarily you have to find something, but there are particular ways to defeat the monster. So you either have to lure it into a trap, where there was one monster when we played it once, I think it's a nightmare thing, and you can defeat it by luring it into a barn that has certain symbols on the wall. You've got to lure it into the barn. Got to do that, otherwise you're not going to defeat it. Or ride on its back over a ploughed field. And I think those are great things. So I agree that having those kind of things in it, good. But you're right, context is everything, isn't it? So in Vaesen, not many monsters. The monsters are quite unique. It's not a world of monsters. It's just a world where there are monsters in it. And in those kind of settings, it's good to have those things. But you say in a more monster-rich environment like Glorantha, you probably wouldn't want that for every monster.
Computer role-playing games are often very much based on that, aren't they? That you need to find things along the way to neutralise the threat of something that you'll encounter. And it's very much about deploying your inventory in the correct way to overcome things to get through a level. Role-playing games, they can use that as a method of moving through, but I think it's less satisfying than if you make a bigger feature of it. Thunder Phase! Okay, last one. Which monster best describes you?
A giant. Probably a giant. I have been called a giant. I mean, there's only never been called any other monster, but I have been called a giant occasionally. So yeah, possibly a giant. Yeah.
Well, you can't just leave it at that. You must have a particular flavour of giant. What kind of giant would you be? What genus of giant are you?
Well, that's a tricky question, isn't it? Because I suppose the lowest pecking of the pecking is the hill giant. They're rather stupid. Well, the other says frost giant, fire giant, hill giants, cloud giants. Yeah, maybe cloud giant. Because I've been accused of having my head in the clouds. So yeah, that's probably it. Yeah, cloud giant. There you go.
But people do say, don't they? What's the weather like up there?
They do. Yeah. So it's cloud giant, isn't it? There you go. That's the monster that best describes me. Yeah. Is it cold up there?
Yeah. I suppose I'd go for a satyr, I think, little goat boy. There we go. We'll leave it at that. Thanks, Blythe. We've got loads of other questions. I think these need to stay in the barrel, I think.
In the barrel? No, you can't go on forever with it.
They'll come out episode 100. Thanks, Blythe. I'll get me coat. Welcome back to the Zoom of Role-Playing Rambling. We're just putting our jackets on. We're heading towards the door, but there's a little bit of residual chat to be had, a bit of closing time chat. I wanted to tell you, Blythe, about a podcast that I've been listening to. You don't listen to them often, do you?
No. Don't even listen to this one.
I've been listening to, it's been pointed out to me on the Discord. I wasn't aware of it, actually. It's called When We Were Wizards. And it charts itself as an oral history of Dungeons and Dragons. It's not quite an oral history of Dungeons and Dragons. It does have the voices of some of the key people who were around TSR at the very beginning, and some of the people who are on the periphery of that story. But it is that story of how Gary Gygax and the people around him created Dungeons and Dragons 50 years ago. And it is a really compelling story. I think it's a really well-produced podcast because it tells a story that in some ways is very familiar to us. It's a really good presentation of it. It really gets into the heart of what it's like starting up a company that goes on to be a worldwide phenomenon. It's very good at the point of the realization that they've reached a paradigm shift in coming up with the concept of role-playing games. And it makes the point that, there's only 4 variations of indoor games: dice games, card games, board games, miniature games. But this was a new strand to it that had really never been articulated and developed before. So I really recommend it. It's 14 episodes, and it tells the rise and fall and rise and fall and rise and ultimate fall. Gary Gygax.
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting point, that, isn't it? Like I say, that kind of the fifth dimension of gaming, where suddenly something changes, where the idea of playing a person in a game, and not just playing a person in a game, but playing a person who has kind of, like you say, agency and some kind of free will in a game to do anything to resolve the problems of the game is quite something, isn't it? Quite remarkable that it took so long for humanity to come up with that idea.
And I know that you're a fan of band stories, or the rockumentary telling of how bands come together. And in a similar way, this is all about the little synchronicities and little coincidences that kind of fuse together to create this thing. It's just, you couldn't it's not like a planned program of activity that brings us to this point. It's just various bits of things coming together as if, I don't say by magic, but by like weird synchronicity. It's
a weird series of coincidences and synchronicities and things that suddenly happen at particular times. But they're always odd, those kind of stories generally, aren't they? Where something's happened and you think, if that hadn't happened, would it have not happened at all?
I have read John Peterson's book, and John Peterson's an academic and historian of role-playing games, and his book is called Game Wizards, and it covers the same period, or a similar period, about what happened, but it uses primary sources, because particularly around the legal documents that were around the case with Arneson and Gygax when they were arguing over royalties in court, and it shies away from the book shies away from using oral accounts of testimony, because John Peterson says people lie, people have different complexions on it depending on the perception. So to get to the truth, you really need to go to the documents. However, listening to the podcast, it might have a different jaundiced view of the situation. Some of it might be in retrospect, but I think it's a bit more fun than reading the book. So Game Wizards, I recommend it. And have you got some closing time chat before you leave?
Closing time chat? Yeah, as you know, Grog Me Tish is on the way, isn't it? And what I decided to do, I've changed my mind since. I decided to, I've done this before, to take an old D&D module, one of the classic D&D modules, and kind of hash it as a one-shot. And a few years ago, I did that with Isle of Dread, the basic, the expert D&D module. I did Isle of Dread, and it's quite good because you could take a little section of Isle of Dread, turn it into a one-shot. But I decided to have another go at that. And I have to say, I found it quite difficult to the point where I've decided to do something else. But it was very interesting reading those kind of old D&D modules and realizing how long-winded a lot of them are. And what I mean by that is, because they hold a particular fascination for me, D&D modules, because when we used to go to Games Workshop, I would see them. They were all cling foil wrapped, film wrapped, weren't they? And of course, because of the Prime Directive, I wasn't allowed to buy in it because Simon had AD&D. So they were all there, and you'd read the back of them, and you'd look at the weird pictures on the front, and you'd think, oh, what's this? The Secret of Bone Hill, or this Sinister Secret of Saltmarsh, all these kind of things. They all look quite tantalising. But of course, never read them, did we? And of course, never played them. Simon never bought them. We did do quite a few of the basic and expert D&D when I did my kind of legal loophole to get through Prime Direct by buying basic D&D, which of course, now we all know is a far better game. But anyway, that's aside. So they have a special kind of fascination for them. And of course, you can get them on drive-through quite cheaply. So I downloaded a few and had a look at them. But yeah, they are quite fascinating in that, in one sense, you could argue that they are value for money because there's a lot of playing, right? There's a lot of playing. But you could also argue that they're incredibly long-winded and incredibly padded to the point where it was really difficult. I abandoned it because I thought, it's really difficult to get a one-shot out of these. It really is, because they're like massive dungeons full of monsters, massive things. Oh, blimey, you know. So like I looked at one called the Beyond the Crystal Cave, which is a British one. It is good. It's a good scenario, actually. But it's magic card. But you go around the garden, and then you finally get to this kind of teleportation machine. And when you get there, you find that you have to find 4 leaves from different trees to operate it. So you haven't collected the leaves. You can't operate it. And of course, you won't have collected the leaves because you don't know at that point. So you've got to go back into the garden that you've been through. You battled your way through it. You've got to go back into it to get the leaves. And on one level, it's quite clever. But you realise it's like, blimey, these things, we play these forever. They go on and on and on. So I abandoned it and went with something that's very much suited towards being a one-shot. So instead for Grog Meat.
And no doubt when you're in the garden, you'll encounter some flail snail that you can easily run away from.
Yeah, well, yeah. Yeah, there's like loads of monsters everywhere. Of course, you know that all these monsters, they're all some of quite interesting encounters. Of course, they do slow it down. And you want to turn it into the one-shot. You start hacking these encounters out and then think, oh, well, now it's becoming a bit boring now because I'm getting rid of them. But of course, keep them in. It takes too long. But yeah, well, I've spent a bit of time doing that. But I do have a particular fascination with, because it's like back in the day, they were like these, let's say, cling film wrapped things that looked quite enticing, but of course you weren't allowed to buy them.
While you're reading them, maybe listen to the podcast and you can understand the context in which they were produced and the need to get out product. There you go.
Yeah, absolutely. There we go.
Right. Cheers, Blythe. Thanks.
Right.
All right. This Cowie Norland Vex's Gaming Rexes or whatever it is.
Thanks for the intro, Dave. I'm Steve, host of All Anthrex's Gaming Vexes, a podcast documenting my ongoing mission to run or at least play all of the RPGs that I seem to be incapable of stopping myself buying.
And you'll see me frequently fiddling with something in my hands.
Each episode, I get together with a group of fellow gamers that have either played a game I've run or who've GM'd a game for me. We chat through what we've enjoyed about the game and some ways we could have improved the experience, whilst making a series of terrible jokes along the way.
Was it hot chat action?
Sometimes we con game designers who really should know better to come along and talk to us about their games, and maybe run an actual play segment to give us an idea of their vision for their game.
I've told this story before, won't bore anyone.
Our topics range from old school favourites like RuneQuest through to some of those newfangled narrative games all the cool kids talk about. When you listen, I want you to feel as though you're sitting around our gaming table, taking part in our post-game chat and helping dispose of the last of the crisps and ale.
I'll just wax my bowstring and think about the death of the tainted.
Oh no, 898.
So, if you like listening to people droning on excitedly about games in a range of regional British accents, All Anthrex's Gaming Vexes is the pod for you, and you'll find it on your podcasting app of choice. On occasion, you may even hear something really insightful, but I'm making no promises. Over to you, Dave.
Point to Ponksies and make it a Titan.
Keep it high.
There isn't another bit.
Thanks to Thomas for making time in his very busy schedule to speak to us. Again, the Forbidden Lands Book of Beasts is highly recommended. It's one of the best I've seen, and those monster attacks are brilliant. If you are Forbidden Lands curious, the latest episode of All Anthrex's Gaming Vexes sees the Vexitarians discussing their run of playing the game. It's both informative and entertaining, and I defy you at the end of it not to want to play the game immediately. As I record this, I'm in recovery from the Owl Bear and the Wizard Staff Convention in Leamington Spa. I have a bit of post-con croak. I think I got it from singing White Snake at very late at night in a pub in the middle of Leamington. It was another great weekend of meeting friends, playing games, and I always come away reflecting on the gaming year ahead. Somehow my biorhythms still follow the school term rather than the calendar year from January, or the municipal year that I follow at work, which starts in April. The new gaming year starts in September, and the Owlbear convention usually launches autumn and winter gaming. For one thing, I've got 2 gaming events to organise. First is Grogmeet-ish, the online event taking place on the 8th to the 10th of November 2024. We're pleased that there'll be a special book club on the Sunday of the event where Ben Aranovich, author of The River of London books, will be joining us in the room of role-playing rambling. The second gaming event I'm organising will be Grogmeet Face to Face, which is taking place on the 17th to the 19th of January. I'll be organising sign-ups and games next month, October 2024. It's getting pretty busy in the den. And if you're interested in my tips on how to organise meetups of your own to create your very own mini conventions, it's going to be a feature in the next Dirk Dossier. These are new supplementary podcasts once a month for patrons. Include some of the outtakes on the cutting room floor from the main podcast and my pontificating. It's a bit more laid back than the Grognard Files, if you can imagine such a thing, but it's a little bit extra for those who continue to support what we do by chucking a tip in the beret. And thanks to everyone who has listened to this episode, and to everyone who has liked, subscribed and passed on the good word. I want to also, as promised, thank patrons past and present for their contribution. There have been some comings and goings over the past couple of months, and your contributions are very much appreciated and keep this show on the road. There are a few returning members too. Welcome back. The new members of the Armchair Adventurers include, at Fancy Poof level, Stephen Dossman, Nick Edwards and Samuel Kilsholm. At the Sofa So Good level and above, I like to give a virtual gift. This time it's from the Book of Beasts. Let's see what flavour those monster attacks have. Okay, first is Gavin Thorpe, a rock troll who was given a skull-crushing blow. Thanks, Gavin. Peter. Don't have your full name, Peter, but you know who you are. But here we go. This is a wolf shadow. Oh, you're inflicted with a nightmarish howl. Next is Michael Lingfelt. This is a Tupilak. And you've got... Oh, this one's a roar of anguish. Bud Wright returns and has taken a high-back chair. And he's got, from a mummy, the breath of death. And last but certainly not least, David Patterson. Good old Dave from the Frankenstein's RPG podcast. He's gone for a contour rug, one of those that you sometimes get around toilets, one of those things. And that's in front of his high back chair. And he's facing an imp. He's got a donkey's head curse. So you've got donkey's head. It looks wonderful on you, Dave. Perhaps you could go to Stratford and appear in A Midsummer's Night's Dream. I'd love to see your bottom. Anyway, don't blame me, blame the dice. If I've cocked up your name or you think I've missed a shout out for you, let me know and I'll put it right. Right, that's enough of monsters. On guard, it is time for a bit more swash and a bit more buckle. Adios, amigos, or should that be au revoir?